Hello, and thank you for joining us for this conversation as part of IDDP's conference on digital citizenship in a pandemic, political information and action in 2020. I'm Lorian Abrams from the Milken Institute School of Public Health here at the George Washington University. We've heard in the previous sessions today about fact-checking political news, how law enforcement is preparing for potential post-election violence, and we've also discussed the impact of disinformation about COVID-19 in communities of color. Our next panel will focus on COVID-19, political mobilization, and digital platforms. We've seen the power of information and disinformation in the era of coronavirus, but how can people cut through the sea of claims and counterclaims on the internet and social media and make sense of the sheer volume of information out there? And what's the responsibility of those who oversee social media platforms to make sure that information out there is actually correct and accurate? So today we have a distinguished group joining us. I'm going to start with you first, David. Dr. David Broniatowski is an associate professor in the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences at the George Washington University, and he's the associate director of the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics. He is perhaps best known for his work where he showed that state-sponsored trolls were responsible for distortions of public opinion about vaccines on social media. Hi, David.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Can you start by telling us about what you think about the quality of health information out there and about your work and what it says about the presence of misinformation campaigns on social media?
Yeah, so thank you very much for that. One of the things to keep in mind about what we're seeing on social media is just that there are a wide range of hidden agendas, different reasons why people may be posting what seems like health information. We can't assume that just because we see something online about COVID-19 or any health topic, be it cancer or vaccines or whatever the case may be, is necessarily intended to inform. Sometimes it may just be there so that you click on a link and buy a product, or in some cases, expose yourself to identity theft. One of the things that our own work has shown is that people use information about public health to essentially try to promote discord, which has geopolitical overtones, as we've seen earlier today. And one of the more recent findings that we have been tracking is that people are using information about various public health issues, including and especially COVID-19, in order to form political movements and to engage in political mobilization so that people can express certain ideals such as freedom of choice and civil liberties and simply use COVID and in particular the desire to ultimately refuse a COVID vaccine when it becomes available as a sign of political identity.
Great, thank you. And turning to you, Nicholas, Dr. Nicholas Velasquez is a lecturer at the Elliott School of International Affairs and the Knight Postdoctoral Fellow at the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics. And Nicholas's work focuses on developing tools to identify signals of coordinated social coordination in online interactions. So Nicholas, given your work, can you tell us what you know about the presence of coordinated campaigns and how they work and whether there are more of them these days, given all the discussions around coronavirus?
Thank you, Lorian. Yes, of course. So a topic that generates fear and that is surrounded by so many uncertainties as COVID is a fertile topic for disinformation and hate campaigns. What my research team does is it focuses on hate networks across different social networks. Hate networks meaning racist, supremacist, fascist groups that coordinate to broadcast their message and to broadcast disinformation. So we were saddened but not surprised to identify how these hate networks are weaponizing COVID. And not only COVID, but also the unpopular public health policies enacted by the government to fight against the pandemic, right? And they've been doing it by spreading disinformation that identifies the hated other, people of color, minorities, Asian Americans, as the responsible for the COVID pandemic, or the agents behind those unpopular public health policies.
Thank you. And then our third panelist is Ifeoma Ozuma. Ifeoma is a tech policy expert with experience leading global public policy initiatives related to content safety at Pinterest, Facebook, and Google. Ifeoma's health information initiatives, including at Pinterest, have been lauded by the World Health Organization, the Washington Post, the New York Times for really leading the way in creating policies that try to limit this kind of misinformation and coordinated campaigns. Ifeoma, can I turn it to you, and can you tell me, what do you think of the existing policies on social media platforms or digital media platforms, and whether they're doing any good in limiting these kinds of hateful coordinated campaigns and using social media for political purposes?
So I'll say a few things. First, thanks for having me on the panel, but platforms have a responsibility here in the same way they have a responsibility to address misinformation around political content, misinformation that targets specific groups. And so when we address health misinformation, and specifically COVID misinformation in the political context, it's important to address it across all issues, because there are the ways that mis and disinformation harm people online are often specific to the platform and specific to the communities that are being targeted. For the efforts that platforms have made, I think in many ways platforms didn't have a choice when the pandemic blew up in the United States, at least. They could no longer pretend that it was an issue elsewhere. Ebola misinformation and disinformation has existed on platforms for years. That was a huge crisis in the areas where it spread. And it was not addressed in any significant way by platforms. There's still a ton of Ebola misinformation if you go on YouTube, on Facebook, on Instagram, wherever. And so I think because the pandemic hit the United States in the way that it did, there was not going to be this sort of leeway from political leaders on both sides of the aisle for not addressing it. And so many of the efforts that platforms have made have been what I would consider PR moves in order to not get in trouble for ignoring this the same way they continue to ignore other health misinformation issues. Many platforms have rampant misinformation on reproductive issues, rampant mis and disinformation on the flu, which we're in a period of the year where we're dealing with a double issue with both flu and COVID diagnoses, which are going to rise. So I think, yes, we should laud some of the work that has been attempted. We should laud the attention to the issue, but we shouldn't trick ourselves into thinking that this has been addressed in any real way or any lasting way by the platforms. And then what I'll say additionally too, is that if platforms address misinformation seriously and actually remove it, they take the sort of efforts that have been taken recently by Facebook and YouTube against QAnon, and Twitter as well, against QAnon and others, and remove a large portion of the information. Unlike with conspiracy theories, with health information, what we're going to be left with is a void if public health communicators don't then add good content. And that content can't be in the form of journal reviews. It can't be in the form of one-pagers. It really has to be tailored to the ways in which people consume the content on the different platforms. So if it's on YouTube, it needs to be an engaging video. If it's on TikTok, the same, Twitter, short form. And so public health communicators also need to step in so that something else doesn't then fill the void that's left by removing the misinformation.
Thank you. So really, you think what's been done so far is really kind of more in the vein of a PR effort rather than effective. Is there any part that is effective that you've mentioned for QAnon? Anything for coronavirus, like for health information?
Well, what has been effective, and it's very, we'll need to look at it going forward because it has been just in the last week that there has been a huge sweeping effort to remove QAnon groups. What's been effective there is in removing the actual groups, removing the accounts that are spreading the misinformation. If the same doesn't happen with COVID content, and specifically as we move closer to a vaccine being on the market or multiple vaccines, if we don't address groups where the misinformation is proliferating, then it's not really effective in my mind, particularly on a platform like Facebook. And so there has to be more of an effort to not just address the content itself in its individual pieces, but the actual purveyors of the mis and disinformation.
Great, thank you. And that brings up a question of coordinated campaigns. I know, Nicholas, you've done a lot of work in this area. You've looked in the dark corners of the internet where racist and hate groups exist and looked to see how they're coordinating and even using misinformation as a weapon. What can you tell us about that work and what it might say for how we could do better in the future at limiting this kind of content? Oh, Nicholas, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
In line as with what Fiona was mentioning and what we saw in the previous panel, one of the problems is that we face an ecosystem that has multiple platforms, some of them regulated, some of them not regulated. For instance, Facebook is a regulated one, 4chan or Gab are unregulated ones. And what we are seeing right now is a coordination by malicious communities to profit from those spaces in, let's say, Facebook or Twitter that have a wide audience that are not properly or are not easy for the platform to police and to monitor. So the best example is given by Ifeana. Facebook groups are a source of disinformation, most of which come from other unregulated platforms like 4chan and Gab. Facebook fan pages, which is a way to describe influencers, recognized influencers, are much more policed by Facebook or similar accounts in other platforms. So the problem is that we need a multi-network approach, right? That these companies might not develop themselves, that might perhaps need to come from regulators, from policymakers, from Congress, right? In order to set limits to what can be distributed. Their business model is not prone to make them collaborate in their own, especially because many of these platforms do not reside in the United States.
And Ifeoma, were you going to jump in there to say something about perhaps coordination across networks?
Yeah, I was going to add a little nuance using an example, spam networks. So when spam first proliferated, platforms did work together. Platforms didn't exist in the way that they exist now, where we're, as at least in this conversation, speaking mostly about social media platforms, but online companies work together, email companies work together to address spam. And I think there's a model there, although it's not the exact same, where companies can work together, and that happened without government regulation. We may be at a point where there's no longer the desire to cooperate because maybe there's a sense that there's a competitive edge here. I don't personally see it, having worked at 3 different platforms, but I do think that we should remind the platforms and then also remind policymakers and anyone else who's part of this conversation that this is not the first time that we have an opportunity for platforms to work together on an issue that fundamentally harms consumers. And so we need to see this as a consumer harm issue as well.
Thank you. And turning to you, David, you've also studied hate speech and misinformation, and what do you know from your research about how misinformation spreads from sort of the dark corners to more mainstream corners, and then even to offline behaviors, if you have anything to say to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the first things to keep in mind is that although social media platforms in particular are very much accessible to researchers, in some sense, there's another sense in which they're not. So in order to be consistent with standards of research ethics, one can't really look into private venues, for example, private groups on Facebook, or other private chats on other platforms where there is an expectation that people are not simply putting their information out there. So I think it's really important for us to realize that what we are observing is really just the tip of the iceberg, right? If we see something like explicit hate speech in, for example, a Facebook group, or even even a Twitter thread or a Telegram chat, right? In those situations, in many cases, those public groups point to private groups. Those private groups point to off-platform venues of some kind. And a lot of these malicious actors gain a lot of their power through a process of artificial amplification. It's a small number, a relatively concentrated number of entities that are making it appear as if there is a wide consensus. That's something that we've seen in some of our own prior work. So, for example, the use of bots on Twitter is one technique that people use in order to artificially amplify their perspective, making it seem as if a small number of what's actually generated by a small number of users is actually coming from a large number of accounts. Now, of course, bots have been in the news a lot recently, but that's only one technique that several of these malicious actors might use. And when you consider that some of these actors have the backing of a nation state behind them, then not only do they have simply a few social media accounts, but they also have state-sponsored propaganda sources. They also have techniques in which they can actually spread rumors through the traditional media or through person-to-person rumor. And so we have to realize that digital platforms and social media platforms, as an even smaller subset of those, are not an ecosystem in and of themselves. They're simply the tip of a much, much, much larger discussion that's going on. So to address your final question, which is to what extent does any of this reflect real world behavior? I think the question to ask is not, does social media change people's behaviors? Rather, it's the opposite question. It's to what extent does social media reflect real world behaviors? Because if we are looking at it from the perspective of just social media impacting on what people do, we're missing the broader point here, which is that social media is only one of the multitude of influences that are out there. And malicious actors are explicitly involved in using all sorts of approaches, all sorts of techniques in order to get their agenda across. And to be clear about this, it's not only state-sponsored actors. In some cases, they are private individuals with a lot of resources. In some cases, there are political movements. There's really a very wide range.
Thank you. And can I follow up and ask, so David, what do you think then, given Ifeoma's idea of social media companies coming together and having coordinated policies that could address some of these things, would this address some of these, for example, state-sponsored initiatives and using bots to amplify a message? Would we get there, or is it just hopeless?
Well, it's certainly not hopeless. One of the first things to keep in mind, speaking as an engineer, I do think that technology has a lot to do with the changes in what we have seen today versus 20 years ago. One of the key things to keep in mind about social media amplification is not so much that the social media allows for the amplification. That's neutral. You can amplify good things or bad things, right? But rather that people expect social media to be democratic. right? Social media has had a story. There's a narrative around our use of social media that's been sold really for the last almost 20 years now, where we've been basically saying that anybody can generate content, and therefore that's going to somehow allow the best information to bubble up to the top. The solution to bad speech is more speech is a phrase that we've heard a lot. And in fact, that is only true when everybody has equal access to speech. What we're seeing is that it's as if you're standing in a crowd and there are millions upon millions of people and they're all talking at the same time, but 5 people have really loud megaphones. And so then they get to drown out everyone else. So I think the key thing to keep in mind here is that, yes, the technology does make a difference. Yes, there are millions of people and they're interacting in all sorts of ways, and there are people who are motivated to do so. At the same time, we're in a new technological environment, right? And so just as in the past, those who had access to the TV airwaves, the 3 big networks, were able to, in many ways, control the narrative and control the discourse. Those who are now able to use the technology to their advantage are much more able to control the discourse. So if we really want to realize the democratic potential of social media, that means in large part ensuring equal access, not necessarily shutting down things or getting rid of the platforms entirely or trying to sort of move back into the past. We have to learn how to adjust to these technologies. And this gets straight to Ifeoma's point about what happens when we get rid of all of the conspiracy theorists from social media platforms. Well, at that point, if our public health officials are not trained and sufficiently well informed in using these new affordances, these new ways that the platforms allow us to communicate in such a way that they can take full advantage of their potential, then somebody else will. And they'll do it in a much more sophisticated way because they'll have seen their own predecessors get blocked.
Thank you. So let's build on that point. Ifeoma, you and now David have both mentioned that there is somehow a void if you take away these some of these conspiracy points of view, and you're left with public health not really using the platforms properly. I wonder if you both can, or if all of you could talk and tell me, what are the differences that in communication styles that are out there, thinking about science skeptics like anti-vaxxers versus science trusting or science groups that fall into the pro-vax camp. What are some of the differences and strengths and weaknesses of these different approaches for communication? Ifeoma, do you want to take it first?
Sure. The thing that I think about often is the ways in which, and Nicholas and David have done the actual research on this. I've seen it more from being at the platforms, but the ways in which public health experts communicate with the public versus the ways that conspiracy theorists and then the folks who are actually making money, so who I would consider fraudsters, are communicating with their adherents or possible adherents. And the difference is in using a peer-to-peer style of communication. That does not exist as much. There are some public health communicators that do an excellent job of that, but that's seen less at the large organizational level. And that's an issue because social media, as David said, has been sold to everyone as a democratic way of communicating and a way that folks are put on a level playing field. But if the communication from public health organizations is still very much top down. We have the information, we're giving it to you. There will be no back and forth. We're sharing information on this topic. There's not the opportunity to talk about other things that are top of mind for you. There will always be a gap in effectiveness because when you go to groups that are pushing parents not to vaccinate their kids for measles. And some of those groups have been co-opted to start spreading lies about the COVID vaccine. When parents raise issues, They're not just raising issues about COVID or about measles. They're talking about their kids in general and all of the issues that they have. And if we forget that people don't experience anything in a vacuum, then the communication is always going to be lacking from public health. That said, public health communicators don't have all day to spend on social media, and they don't have all day to be answering questions. And so I think there has to be some sort of sorting of prioritizing certain platforms and setting aside some time at least to answer people's questions and meet them where they are.
Thank you. Nicholas, I'm going to turn it to you. Any observations from your work?
Yes, certainly. So two things. The first one is, well, what Ifeana says it's real. There's also good news in interviews we had and research we had contact with public health stakeholders in the past. We've identified that these stakeholders, the vaccination authorities of several countries, international organizations like the WHO, are aware of this need to develop a trend of communication that reaches into communities in a more horizontal way, not just from a vertical authoritative way, but also from an equal to equal, expressing their sound public health and sound science advice in terms that people can relate from their own perspective, from their own life. Right? I always say that it is a problem of mothers to mothers and pet owners to pet owners, simply because, as a second point, one of the tools we have developed here at GW is a tool that identifies which social organization, which social movement, which grassroots movements are being targeted by the anti-vaxxers and the pro-vaxxers. This gives you a map, and in that map, it is clear that categories like pet owners and mothers are the prime targets of the anti-vaxxers. It is not big organizations that they're targeting, but the communities of mother of a particular town in a particular country, the community of pet owners of a particular neighborhood in a big American city. That's the level of targeting that they have, and that's also the level the anti-vaxxers have, and that should also be a similar level of targeting that the public health community should use.
Yeah, thank you. So that's really interesting. So if we can stay on top of kind of what anti-vaxxers are, groups they're targeting, mothers and pet owners, then as public health officials and communicators, we should really be targeting the same groups, which probably we're not doing now. David, turning to you, I'm wondering what you can tell us based on your work. I understand that you've done a lot of work looking at the different communication styles between pro-vaccination and anti-vaccination groups.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I'm going to say two things that are perhaps a little controversial. First is that I've come to believe that there is no such thing as a modal anti-vaxxer, which is to say that we can't take everybody who is skeptical or hesitant about vaccination and lump them into some single organized group as if they're all playing from the same playbook. And in fact, some of the work that Nicolas was talking about has shown quite clearly the massive diversity among different types of anti-vaxxers, as well as our own work. And so one of the things that we see is that people oppose vaccination for a wide variety of different reasons, either because they believe in natural health and they are skeptical of Western medicine, or because they have misinformed beliefs about vaccines causing harm, or because they don't trust the government to actually ensure the safety of vaccines. And what we've seen more and more is that these different groups are starting to agree on a framing that doesn't require them to agree. So what I mean to say by that is more and more we've seen a rise in a discourse around vaccine refusal that's framed as civil rights or individual choice or right to choose. And the thing about this particular framing is that if it's your right to choose, then you can decide to refuse vaccines for whatever reason you want. If you're free to refuse vaccines, then you can do it because you believe natural health is better, or you can do it because you believe that the government isn't trustworthy, or because you believe that the science isn't trustworthy. All of these different reasons become encompassed within this broader discussion about the values of the right to choose. And so that's something that we've started to see adopted by a wide range of state-level political movements. And again, this actually dovetails with several other sorts of discourses that emphasize the freedom of the individual, or individualism, which is associated with, in the US, more of a libertarian philosophy, and has been more and more co-opted by specific political parties around the world. And so we're seeing this focus on a right to choose really around the world. And again, the key take-home message here is not that all of the anti-vaxxers are agreeing, but rather that they are focusing, the elites among them are focusing on a discourse that doesn't require that they agree. So to me, that provides sort of a risk and an opportunity. So one of the things that is an opportunity is that if they don't necessarily have to agree, then that means that there's not actually a unified argument. That means that divide and conquer may actually work. And then this is where we get to the second controversial thing that I'm going to say, which is that if you want to convince people who oppose vaccines that they should take vaccines, then you have to be willing to at least entertain the possibility that you may be wrong. Not that you're wrong about the science, right? Because the science has a very strong, solid factual base. But you have to be willing, when there's uncertainty, you have to be willing to have a conversation about that uncertainty. You have to be willing to acknowledge that people don't necessarily all share the same values. And then there has to be an ongoing conversation. It's not just one and done. There has to be an ongoing conversation where if somebody is going to take up a vaccine, they have to see why that's consistent with the values that they hold. So, for example, maybe somebody believes very strongly in the value of individualism, but they also believe that it's their responsibility rather than their right to protect their family, to protect their loved ones. And if we focus on a discussion about how wrong they are to be focused on themselves, well, that actually has the framing of making them into a villain of sorts, which nobody wants to see themselves in that way. So I think that when it comes to communication, I absolutely agree that horizontal and vertical communication approaches both have their place. I would go one step beyond that. And I would say that we have to directly engage with people's values. And we have to be willing to have a conversation that's not, I have the facts, I'm right, you don't have the facts and you're wrong. It has to be, these are the facts. Now let's talk about what they mean. And what do they mean for you? And let's have a conversation that builds community. Because once we build community, then we can start talking about things like, why is this right thing for the community? Without a community, there's no conversation to be had.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Brings up so many topics. I mean, it brings up the issue of what can, given that this is really, one solution is a horizontal conversation over time, building community about values. Like these are long, in-depth conversations, which are resource intensive. Like what realistically with public health agencies, with strapped budgets, can the public health community do? And also what can the social media companies do to also kind of weight it so that the public health voice is a little bit louder? I'm going to turn it to you first, Ifeoma.
Yeah, so it is a long-term conversation, but it doesn't have to be effective just in the long term. Again, I'm going to use Ebola as an example again. The Ebola work that was done in the DRC and in other countries in Central and Western Africa was groundbreaking and has been lauded as such because the conversations happening on the ground and via radio communication and a little bit on social was very much around communities and their needs. So going to community leaders, working with community organizations, and having folks who are already respected as authority figures in each community then share the facts, but then also talk about people's values and why it was important for them to include the facts in their decision making. And so that exact same sort of approach can be happening and is happening in some communities here in the United States. I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico. In Northwest New Mexico, the largest outbreak we had in the state was in Navajo Nation, which spans across New Mexico and Arizona. Those same sorts of efforts were made in Navajo Nation, and that is what has brought the outbreak under control in a way that we're not seeing in other places where there isn't as much of a focus on community and community leaders working to convince people that accepting the facts and then learning what they need to address is part of public health. So you can't just tell someone, go wash your hands when they don't have access to water. We have to address the water issues as well. And so there's the opportunity to do that. Resourcing is an issue, as you say, and that's where I think platforms can step in. They're practically printing money right now, and I think they need to put their money where their mouths are. And if this is an issue that is important to them, they need to be financially supporting both community organizations and public health organizations that are doing this work, both online and offline.
Great, thank you. So when you say platforms can step in, and certainly they have resources that they could donate to needy communities, but are there things that they could also do that go back to that issue of platform policies and platform design and platform architecture that would give smaller communities or give public health agencies a louder voice? And Ifeoma, you want to talk to that again too?
Yeah, Nicholas raised his
Nicholas?
Yeah.
Go. I'll turn it to Nicholas and then we can come back to you.
Thank you. So regarding that particular question, what could the platforms do? I am certain that they could provide resources, but they can provide technical resources in two ways. First, and this is more a political science than a data science answer. Again, the social networks can tell you whom are the key leaders, key social movements that you as a public health organization want to get allied with. What are your key partners, your strategical partners, right? All across geography and also in those corners of the internet that are global, right? And pointing you to those leaders, pointing you to those communities, those influencers and those communities is a first step in establishing that social network of your own. So leverage other people's social capital and build social capital between you as an expert and them as local experts or knowledgeable organization at the local level. Right? And now, from a data science perspective, most social networks have algorithms that recommend to you content based on your behavior. One thing they could do, the social network could do, is redirect whom you are getting directed on the basis of sound scientific and public health policies, right? If you're looking into, you're searching for bogus information about COVID or vaccines, then get the search results from the search engine to point you to sound scientific sources or to support communities. To one degree or another, all major North American and European social media platforms are doing something of the sort, right? But they're doing it essentially for their search engines. They're not doing it for the content that gets promoted to you as you scroll down through their feeds, right? That's something that they could leverage.
Thank you, thank you. David, do you want to add anything to this conversation about really what can public health groups do better to improve the quality, and what can social media companies offer as a resource in this shared mission?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's really important to realize that different platforms have very different designs. And those designs have a strong impact on the ways in which people interact. So we've spoken about Facebook and Facebook groups and Facebook pages. Facebook has as one of its stated missions building community. And the very structure of Facebook actually allows for building community. Unfortunately, we're now in an environment where people have built community around sets of beliefs that are quite dangerous for society. And so there is an opportunity to take advantage of the structure of Facebook to be able to address that. For example, in Facebook, there are administrators. Groups have administrators, pages have administrators. And as Nicolas pointed out, pages are much more policed by those administrators than our groups. Facebook has policies about what is allowed to be posted in groups. To a large extent, some of those policies are not enforced. But if administrators were held responsible for what is posted inside their groups, that actually solves two problems for Facebook. One is it solves a problem of accountability, because now it's very clear who is responsible for the content. Secondly, it solves a problem of scale, because it means Facebook doesn't have to stay on top of every single message. They simply have to delegate to some degree some of that authority to that administrator who stays on top of the messages in that page or group. Now, that being said, of course, that means that there has to be a little bit more of a process for selecting administrators, and that may be something that government could provide some help with. That's one possibility. Now, of course, that approach will not work for Twitter because we don't have groups. When we're looking at a platform like Twitter, where you have essentially broadcast communication, it's much more prone to things like bot-driven artificial amplification, because that's simply what the platform allows. People do use direct messages, but they're much more private, and that sort of middle layer of groups is not present, except to the extent that you take account of hashtags and things like that. So you're going to need a different strategy for Twitter than you would for Facebook. YouTube, of course, is different entirely. TikTok is primarily a video-based platform and is different as well. So what is the role that public health officials can take in all of these? Well, first of all, there's a question about public health policy. And at the level of policy, we have to be what we call in systems engineering solution neutral. We can't say that a particular algorithm or a particular approach is going to cut across platforms. We have to specify high-level functional objectives. Those functional objectives may be, for example, that specific topics are not going to be allowed to go past a certain threshold, right? For the sake of argument. And then each platform has to figure out for itself, how does it achieve that objective given the technology that that platform implements. And that's something that I feel like we haven't really seen very often, is this specification of the way in which the technology and the policy interact. I think we need to do a lot more. We need to have a lot more conversation about that. The individual public health communicator, of course, has to be trained to use that platform. The techniques that you use on Twitter will not be the same and will not be effective if you use them on Facebook or TikTok. And so we have to have people who are trained. And this, of course, requires training and requires resources. Those same people have to be trained not only in using the platforms and the technology, but in figuring out how to communicate the bottom line message that the person on the other end, on the recipient end, should be concluding. So we actually need a new cadre of people that are trained on one hand in the use of a specific platform, and on the other hand, in being able to distill very complex public health messages into something that people can easily understand on that platform. This is not a technological problem alone. It's not a policy problem alone. It's something that requires knowledge of both. And I think we're going to start to see the rise of essentially a new profession that, if it's sufficiently resourced, will have to take on this role.
Yeah, thank you. So that's interesting. And I know we're coming to the close of our time, so I just want to come back to you, Ifioma. Anything you would like to add to this topic of what social media companies can do, as well as how we could train our next generation of public health practitioners with social media.
Yeah, I think a good first step would be sharing more of what they're seeing. Twitter is easily studied by researchers in this area because most of everything on Twitter, other than messages, is public. I don't know that we have enough data on the actual causation relationship between what people are seeing in different forms of misinformation and their actual behaviors to then build whole programs around mis or disinformation. I'm not saying that they're not harmful. Misinformation and disinformation about health is harmful. But I think platforms, as a very first step, need to share more of the data of what they're seeing, both the content and the reach of the information that they're seeing and the reach of the groups that are the most prolific with researchers, so that then more work can be done around that to determine where resources should be directed first.
Great, thank you. And on that note of sharing data, I would say that one other area where there seems to be a lot of where we really are missing knowledge because of lack of sharing data is around how the different policies that they're implementing, which Fiona, you mentioned earlier, in some ways are PR efforts, but in some ways maybe genuine initiatives, but how well are they actually working? Are they limiting disinformation? Are they limiting misinformation? Are they changing the actual ecosystem of social media? And I think we just don't know enough because we don't have the full data. So on that note, I'm going to close and thank you, Ifioma, David, and Nicholas, for your wisdom and all your great perspectives today. Again, I'm Laurian Abrams from the Milken Institute School of Public Health at George Washington University. And before we wrap up, I'm going to turn it over to the Institute for Data Democracy and Politics Director, Rebecca Tromble.
We close today's conference just 2 weeks before one of the most consequential elections in our nation's history. In the midst of a pandemic, with coronavirus cases rising rapidly around the country, we are experiencing this historic moment largely online. Our political words and actions are filtered through webcams, Zoom rooms, text messages, and of course, social media platforms such as YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. From fact-checking online campaigns to assessing the potential for post-election violence, today's discussions have provided greater insight into what it means to be digital citizens in 2020. I'm incredibly grateful to all of our panelists for sharing their thoughts and expertise, to my fellow moderators for facilitating these conversations, to members of our audience for taking time out of their busy day to contemplate these important topics. And I'm especially grateful to all the behind-the-scenes staff who have been working nearly nonstop for the last 2 months to bring this event together. I sincerely hope that next year I will be able to greet all of you at the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics in person, welcoming you to George Washington University's campus with a handshake or a hug. Until then, please be safe, be well.